I'm Dr. Ross Brummett, the Senior Vice President for Student Affairs, and it's my distinct honor to get to do this morning's introductions. First, I'm going to read what I'm supposed to say, and then I'm going to ad-lib a little bit. Each year, as a part of our commitment to the liberal arts, Carson-Newman invites a variety of speakers to address our 6 great ideas: truth, beauty, goodness, justice, courage, diversity. This year, for our Great Ideas lecture, we're pleased to be joined by recent Carson-Newman graduates who have demonstrated a unique and inspiring commitment to these great ideas in their professional and personal lives. Over the course of the next few months, we invite you to learn from these men and women who were sitting in these same pews just a few years ago, and consider how you might implement these values into your own budding professional and personal lives. Today, we are pleased to welcome back to campus Isaac Sharp and Jameson McGregor. Isaac is currently a PhD candidate at ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York City and a graduate of McAfee Theological Seminary in Macon, Georgia. He recently co-edited the book Evangelical Ethics, a Reader, from Westminster John Knox Press. Jameson, a graduate of Truett Seminary in Waco, Texas, currently serves as worship and arts pastor at University Baptist Church in Waco. Last year, he released his first full-length album, Wild One, that explores the themes of faith, hope, doubt, pain, and God. And later on tonight, Jameson will be playing music from this album and a forthcoming EP at 7 o'clock over at Eagle Eyrie outside of Maples, front of Butler Blank. Now, here's the ad-lib part. I had the distinct honor of teaching these two guys. Isaac graduated in 2010, Jameson in 2011. Indeed, I was Isaac's honors thesis supervisor. So when I look at them, I see you. And when I look at you, I see them. We're talking about the fact that it really is true. We bring them back because they have sat where you now sit. And these guys will tell you that if 10 years ago, when we had these conversations, that just because you did not know exactly what you were to major in or what God was calling you to, or even if the job was out there, told them time and time again, just because you don't know if it's out there doesn't mean that it's not out there. And just because it's not out there right now doesn't mean that it won't be out there when it needs to be out there for God to call you to it. They both have phenomenal narratives. They both are phenomenal men. They both are products of this great place called Carson-Newman University, and they're dear, dear friends to many of us. So if you would, join with me in welcoming Isaac Sharp and Jameson McGregor back to Carson-Newman.
So, why are we here, though? There's this piece that Dr. Brummett says we've been invited back to talk to you all about something, but why are we here?
Yeah, sure. I can speak to why I think I might be here.
Tell us why you are here first.
So when I was here, I was a religion major with the intention of going on to be to do seminary and to get a PhD and then teach theology of some sort. Also, when I was here, I started writing songs because why? My theological world was falling apart because I was asking questions I never asked before. And writing songs is how I made sense of that, put it back together. And I kept doing that as I went on. So get to seminary and still am intending on going into PhD world and moving beyond that. And while I was doing that, I was playing at a church that I loved and being formed by this community. And then my last fall semester of seminary, when I was investigating PhD programs, the guy who had the worship and arts pastor job at UBC was leaving, and my congregation asked me to apply to take his place. So over the span of like 2 weeks, my entire future changed. So I now am a worship and arts pastor at a church tasked with thinking about music and liturgy and beauty and stuff like that. So, beauty. Isaac, why might you be here?
It seems like I'm just here to ask you questions. your job literally is to think and work with beauty in this space, and it seems like the reason I'm here is to ask pointed questions to you about this. I'm your interviewer, perhaps. The question of why we are both here, though, there's a little more to that piece than Dr. Brummett got into, in that Jamie and I are best friends. So we have and became friends here at Carson-Newman, and since that time have almost uninterruptedly at least 2 hours of in-depth conversation a week via phone from New York City to Waco, Texas, where we talk about any number of things, life and God and faith and family and art and beauty and politics and any number of things. We are in dialogue and have learned a lot from each other over the years in dialogue. So the idea of why we, too, might be here is that to model, we think, dialogue about topics, right? About these categories that we've talked about, these great big ideas. If there is something to talk about with beauty, and Jamie and I have had a long-running dialogue about things for the last, 10 years now? Then we decided that we would model dialogue, that kind of dialogue for you. And so in preparation for that, we have spent the last, couple of months writing back and forth to each other, question and answers about beauty. And we have 24 pages of material that we will not run through all of it today. So we're going to try to pick from some of the best of that and ask each other some questions back and forth to try and model for you how we have learned from each other in preparation for what we're doing today. We both have come to new insights about this thing that we're calling beauty. So that's why I think we are here. And so now, though, in terms of the topic, I want you to tell me, Jameson, as a worship and arts pastor, what is beauty?
I do not know. I really don't, but I think beauty is an interesting thing, right? Because this is something that is part of human existence. We all think we know what beauty is. We think that there are things that are or aren't beautiful. But I don't know that we generally spend a lot of time investigating that. I think it becomes shorthand for something that we like or don't like, or some version of that thing. And we might think oh, well, it's something stirring about this, therefore it's beautiful and I like it. But I know that in my experience and in my direct surroundings, I don't often encounter people who really dig in and think, okay, well, what does that mean though? So it has sort of this broadness, and this is a huge umbrella topic-wise. So I guess in regard to that up front, some oversimplification that we will go ahead and do is within a large umbrella of beauty. Ways to experience that might be within natural beauty. You see a beautiful mountain or something, and then art, things that people make. Okay, there's surely more things you could split up, but that'll be what we run with. So, over the years, I have had occasion to think about beauty in different ways. As a songwriter, there's an eye toward beauty, perhaps, in constructing something. But there's one particular idea that I encountered that I feel like really was a light bulb moment that changed it. I don't know if this is the be-all and end-all, but some part of this has to be, there has to be something to this. So that's what we're going to chase for a little bit. There's a woman named Madeline Engel, who is a novelist writer. She wrote A Wrinkle in Time, which is sort of famous, and I believe going to be a movie soon. She has a book called Walking on Water that is a collection of reflections on faith and art. And the way that she talks about art in this is a pretty expansive idea of art that probably goes beyond just art, so maybe beauty. But she's going through a section where she talks about trying to decide what art is for herself and reading all these different people's things. And then she grabs a Leonard Bernstein quote that is this: art is cosmos emerging from chaos. And she develops that. And I thought about that, and I said, I really like that idea because it feels sufficiently vague to have something worthwhile about it, and began to chew on this and think about what that might mean. There's also a guy named John O'Donohue who is a Irish poet, philosopher, theologian, who has a book called Beauty. And in reading that, there was something that jumped out at me because it felt like it resonated with this idea from Engel. And he says, beauty is that which invites us into order, cohesion, and unity. Now, I like the language of cosmos better than order and cohesion. Maybe unity's fine, but this idea of this invitation. So you get these really vague ideas, and leave it to a couple of poets to offer that. That feel like might be a good way forward. But within that, I think we get to a place where perhaps beauty is not a quality of things, like an attribute of something that's just objectively true about it. Like, this is beautiful, and if you don't think so, you're wrong. And I am right. If that were true, I mean, I don't know why we'd even be talking about it, right? It'd just be you're wrong or right, and this is how you find beauty. But perhaps there's something that beauty is not necessarily a quality. Perhaps beauty is a realm of experience. Perhaps beauty is something that happens to you. Now, fair enough. We will probably continue to reference beauty as though it's a quality of things, so that's how we talk culturally, right? But we're going to stay with it, think, okay, what might this mean if this were true? But yeah, something that happens to you with this cosmos language. Maybe it's this sort of like resonance within us. So cosmos from chaos image obviously is taken from this like Genesis creation story kind of thing. God calls cosmos out of the chaos waters or whatever. So there we might think of this as a point of like, okay, this is a resonating with perhaps an echo of something very fundamental to human existence. This reminds us of this. Art itself might be drawing something out of nothing, or perhaps taken differently from the angle of the idea that this invites us into something. Maybe the cosmos that emerges from chaos is the moment where we see something and we feel known, and we emerge out of ourselves in some way. We're taken out of like just our own individual particularity, and we feel like a sense of connection to something. Because that feels nice, right? You don't really want to be alone. So those are some things. Yeah, so I guess two more particular examples. I've seen some people say, like, the reason why a lot of people like going out in nature and looking at things like mountains is because in seeing that, you realize that you are a part of something very old and something very big, and it's much bigger than yourself. Or you gaze into the depths of space and think like, oh man, what are we? We're so small. This kind of sense of wonder. And then within art, the same sort of thing. So this, you hear a song, you're like, oh, that's exactly how I feel sometimes. And this feeling of being known. So yeah.
Okay. So I'm following you here. So Jamie, you are saying this idea that you've come across of cosmos being drawn from chaos has helped you think about beauty in a new way, right?
Yes.
So this for me, though, I have to press you on this one. What about, then are you suggesting that disorder or chaos is necessarily not, right? So music is a good example. What about dissonance? Is the same dissonance? What about, is there the possibility that there can be right? So if cosmos from chaos is what you're going to use as a way to talk about beauty, is it possible or not that there can be beauty in chaos? Let me press you there.
The answer is sure. No.
All right, thanks.
I feel like we carry an assumption that when we accurately define something as chaos or dissonance or whatever. Like, so it is that, but in terms of like at its core, is that the way that it's functioning, right? So I can talk about this a few different ways. I will say up front, maybe that is a linchpin to this. Maybe that just makes it all fall apart, but maybe not. Within the realm of music, you might think of what would be really dissonant, like punk music. Okay, this is typically, there's not really an eye towards beauty in punk music. It's loud, it's fast, and it's raucous, and it's just tearing stuff down. But maybe within that, throwing your fist up to the man, so to speak. You were saying, hey, what you've presented as order, cohesion, and unity is bankrupt. And like through this symbolic act of rebelling against this convention, this is a drawing toward justice or truth, whatever. That is really drawing some sort of like cosmos out of this. Maybe so in the way it functions, it's different. Maybe not. We could also think about like a different way to try and decide something is dissonant or something that we might call dissonant. Think about like Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is very famous and thought of as a good musician. But like most people aren't like, he has the most beautiful voice. It just stirs my soul, and it's so pretty and pleasant to listen to. Same with like Leonard Cohen, if you've listened to Leonard Cohen. But by some measure, like the vibe of that serves the work that they're doing, serves to further communicate that, and it's rising out of this like genuine place, right? So like there can definitely be beauty with that. It's just not a surface level aesthetic thing.
So what you're saying is in music, for instance, that beauty, it does not necessarily just mean that it sounds good.
Yes. Okay, and then beyond that, we might think of themes that seem to us to be chaotic or not cosmos in regard to this. So like things that are sad. A way into thinking about that, I guess, is when you, if you are a creator of any sort, if you experience some kind of like chaos in life, some kind of pain, whatnot, and then turn to a creative medium to engage that, to express it, usually that is like helpful in some way, making sense of that. You have ideas of art therapy and stuff like that. Because in some way you are very literally taking this thing that is just oppressive around you, this ethereal thing, and you're making it into something. You're processing it and delivering it. And that product might be rather dark, sad, chaotic when it comes out, but the function that it is playing is this drawing forward. There is and maybe not just for yourself, but for the act of listening to music like this. Perhaps it might have the same experience. So, two different random examples. There's a guy named Connor Oberst who used to be in a band called Bright Eyes, and he has a song called Poison Oak. The end of this song, I think, expresses this idea well. He's laid out this like some sort of tragic interpersonal thing that he has experienced. He's had a loss of some sort. And it ends with this image of him at a piano. And he says, when I press the keys, it all gets reversed. The sound of loneliness makes me happier. So on the one hand, like that's just a, grade A emo line, but also maybe true. Maybe that's a representative of experience. Kierkegaard has a quote, paraphrasing this, that is the poet is one who experiences great affliction, and when he or she cries out in pain, their lips are so formed that it emerges as beautiful music. So when we say to the poet, sing for us again, we're really saying, may new troubles befall you, which is sort of a dark turn on that. But perhaps it's not just because like, oh yeah, sing for us again, it feels good. It might be like this is something that we attach ourselves onto, feel known. I do feel better when I listen to this because it's helping me process what I'm experiencing. All that to say, we need not assume that our surface level judgment of something as beautiful or not, or cosmos or chaos or not, is accurate. I think the point is there's an investigative element of this. We look deeper.
Okay, so it's more than just what we think of as pretty or pleasing to the ear or eye. This is what you're driving forward here, right?
Yes.
Okay. No, I'm with you. But in terms, though, of... So we're thinking of beauty in this way, but what you do as your job, right, is in some ways related to this, right? But I want to know about, we've been taught, like, this is like philosophical that we've been talking about so far, trying to define this thing. I want to know, like, what that looks like, okay? In the context of Jameson, you are a worship and arts pastor, okay? Something there, I'm sure, you are, like, hired to deal with beauty, right? So what does all of this philosophical discussion of beauty have to do with what you do every day as you're what do you do? What's your job?
Well, I think to talk about that, I'll need to do a few more philosophical things. In terms
No, please.
Not philosophical. So at UBC, this is a church that has beauty as a core value in some way. So that looks like this. We have a benediction that we say every week, and that is UBC as we approach this week. May we love God, embrace beauty, live life to the fullest. We also have a mission statement, or vision statement, I don't know the lingo, that is UBC seeks to form a community in the way of Christ that embraces beauty and lives missionally. So those are saying very similar things, but there's only one phrase that is carried over between both, and that is embrace beauty. But what does that mean? That's not necessarily intuitive. And on the one hand, I kind of like that. I think that it poses an open question. What might it mean to embrace beauty? But if I were to sum it up, I think there's probably a few ways to come at it. I think there's a basic assumption laid in there that, hey, we have the capacity for beauty, for imagination, for engaging these things. Perhaps that is not an accident. And perhaps, beyond that, it is a gift that we are then implicitly called to be good stewards of. So it starts with that. And then, two, it's, okay, so if we think that we have this capacity and it might be meaningful, do we have any reason to think it might be? Well, yeah. I think if we look at the Bible.
Why? Yeah. Why?
If we look at the Bible.
Okay.
The Bible itself, I think, uses this, let's call it a window into a human person, right? In terms of poetry and art, this is pretty prevalent. I saw a figure recently that said a third of Scripture is poetry. I don't know if that's, I haven't done the math, so don't quote me on that. But it's a lot. We have a poem to tell us where everything came from, right? We have a poem at the beginning of Genesis. We have a book of songs and poems we call the Psalms. We have narratives that are constructed in ways that aren't just trying to report to us information, but in a way that communicates something deeper. This capacity for this imaginative impulse to say more than it is in fact saying, to shape us in some way. Great example of that, Jesus often teaches in parables, right? Particularly when talking about the kingdom of God. So a parable kind of begs a question of the listener. It offers you an image, and then oftentimes won't resolve. Jesus does not always go in and tie it up and be like, oh, this is what it means. Does it a couple times. But why? Just so that you have to chew on it? Well, maybe. Maybe beyond that, to speak of the kingdom of God is to speak of something that is not best spoken about by talking propositional truth claims. Perhaps this is something that is removed in such a way that you're better off painting a picture with a multitude of stories. And what might that mean? Might that be true of all of theology? I believe Abraham Joshua Heschel says that theology is metaphor is the language of theology, because our words are going to fall short. Therefore, we should assume that we are painting pictures with images and things like that. So we have that within the Bible. This is clearly, if we're going to look to this as an avenue by which God seeks to communicate things to us and also to shape us, perhaps, then it seems as though the avenue of the imagination is at play there, or the capacity for beauty or experiencing this. So then we carry that into thinking okay, well, maybe this isn't a one-off thing. Maybe this faculty that we have is actually an avenue by which God chooses to communicate to us or influence us, transform us, might be a nice word.
So what does that look like, again, what does that look like in the context of your job as a worship pastor, right? I get what you're saying.
I'm getting to it.
Okay.
I promise. So I think that then goes to a concern of perhaps that the way that we experience that and find it is via looking a particular way, learning how to look, having a lens that is so formed that we are able to receive this and engage it. My wife is an art history major, or was an art history major, and now she works in our department. And there was a time where she was telling me, trying to summarize for me what this field in fact is. And she said, well, it could be summarized one way by saying this is learning how to look. saying that to engage art in particular, perhaps your first impressions are not necessarily going to be the best. Maybe there's questions that you aren't going to intuitively ask that could help you unlock this piece to make it sort of like bloom and becomes a window into something more. So it's learning to carry a curiosity of sorts that asks questions of composition, of provenance, so the time and place that a piece arose from, its location within the broader history of art, what might it be referencing or influenced by, what might it later do, and then like thinking about the artist themselves and excuse me, the artists themselves and the things that they're experiencing and what they might be processing or what they have said about a piece or something like that. So you have all this information beyond just like looking at it and you're like, oh, doesn't do anything for me, moving on. You know, so this is something that a skill that can be learned and things like that. And what? Sorry, man. And then so in light of that, I feel like the way that we carry that as a church in giving a charge to ourselves to embrace beauty, some part of that is influenced by saying, hey, let's together think that, okay, maybe this matters, and so form ourselves as to look for beauty in the world and think about it in a theological context. So in my job in particular, to get around to the question that you actually asked me,
there it is, okay,
which would make little to no sense without all that, I have a lot of jobs. I sort of have two that are super important. I am tasked with crafting our liturgies, and I'm tasked with writing songs. So within the liturgical component, the idea is that when we gather on a Sunday morning for our liturgy, on the one hand, we are worshiping God, yes. On the other hand, this is a mechanism that is transformative. This forms us into the way of Christ, is the idea. So the words that we say and the things that we do and the way the space is and things like this is all feeding into shaping us in a particular way, whether we want it to or not. And the side note, the same is true in the transformative capacity of anything that you do. Go to the mall. You can have the liturgy of the mall and value and consumption and all these things. You can go to a sporting event, and that's going to shape you in a certain way. You can go hang out with friends in a particular context, and that's going to shape you in a certain way. You're constantly being formed by something. So anyway, within the liturgical component, essentially I'm putting words in people's mouths. That's my job. I write readings that people will participate in together. And I write prayers that we will read together, or I ask people to write prayers or seek them out. I guess I curate that moment. So that's an aspect of my job that I have to carry an eye toward the effect of that. And I would say that that whole enterprise is sort of a living poem or performative act that is could be an avenue towards beauty. Excuse me. We also observe the church calendar. So this is a story that guides us through the year, and it's essentially a way to engage the story of God and the people of God in history. So begins with Advent and circles around the Christ King Sunday. We'll belabor the point, but we live inside of a story that causes us to interrogate things that we already think that we know about again and again and again. We're reading the same passages often at these different times, but this is a way that is shaping us by this story to live out our part of the story in the world now. I also write songs. That is an expectation placed upon me, and I love it.
You do what?
I write songs. And in that
concert tonight,
that is sort of an avenue where I put the things that we're doing in a liturgy and the church calendar, the sort of parts of the story that we're in conversation with the things that I know, in fact, are going on in the lives of people. Their joys, their pains, etc. To have language to both form us in a certain way by the story, but also to be expressive of an actual set of circumstances. And trying to think if there's anything else relevant to answer your question. But that employs metaphor mostly as the avenue where both those things are accomplished at one time, which is sort of playing off our capacity for beauty. So go ahead.
No. So the answer that helps. You are helping me understand what you do as a worship pastor to shape people in a worship space to beauty as a possibility of shaping how they think and how they interact with God and the world. But what? Okay, so what difference does that make, though?
Yeah.
Right? Like, presumably UBC has decided that it is important to have you on staff to shape how people think about beauty. Okay, so if you are shaping how people think about beauty, okay, so what?
What difference does it
Yeah,
exactly
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts about that, a couple of different angles. The beauty has the capacity to draw us outside of ourselves, I do believe. Has the capacity. Doesn't mean that it will, in fact, do that. But perhaps if there is something to the way that you look at something, having eyes to see, so to speak, depending on what you're going to get out of that, maybe this shaping is worthwhile. So, two different stories. My wife, Adair, like I mentioned earlier, she is a big fan of roses. Last I counted, we had 20 rose bushes in our backyard, and I believe there are more on the way, but I will happily plant for her. For the most of my life, I don't think that I've ever been in a place where I didn't think flowers were, like, pretty. But in terms of, like, stopping and thinking, like, what a beautiful rose, and really soaking that in, I don't know that I've ever really done that. But my wife does. That's a big part of things that she engages, and she can look at it and talk about it. So it was through her doing that one day, and I stopped to listen, because that's what you do. You don't want to be a jerk and just walk and be like, okay, nice flower. And in listening to her talk about it, I found something interesting happened. I was able to see the things that she was seeing in the way that she was seeing them. There was some sort of exchange of lens there, so to speak. I took on then a capacity to find beauty in a rose. That, yes, this is on the one hand a bad example because it's my wife, and maybe there's more going on there than that. But it works. But yeah, so an interesting thing happens with that. On the one hand, I have, I guess, maybe three things. I now have an open option to look at a rose and maybe resonate with that in a different way than I did before. Two, I feel like I know my wife better. There's a piece of her like experience that I then enter into and think like, oh wow, I'm seeing part of the world through your eyes. And then also, because the lens that I now have access to is from her, I feel sort of known. It's like, oh, well, no, she gets what this is like, existentially, you know, which is a transformative element. Different story. There's a guy named Derek Webb who's a songwriter, and he's not like a super famous songwriter. He's fairly famous. I saw him say one time the way he thinks about the job of an artist is for someone to look at the world and tell us what you see. So this is a similar idea, right? This is puts the idea in our minds that perhaps art, music, etc., is a way of someone offering up a lens for you, the way they see the world. And perhaps there's elements of that you connect to implicitly, and that's you resonate, you feel known immediately, and perhaps that shapes you in a way that you are drawn out of yourself and put into some sort of communion with this interconnectivity. And I think that ultimately maybe both of those things are talking about capacity for empathy, that perhaps if engaged in the proper way, beauty has the capacity to bloom a sense of empathy within us. So I would say that is a big difference. And then one sort of lingering question that I have in thinking about this in the context of a church, and I don't have an answer for this, is if that is true. I feel like that is experientially true for me in relating to art. When we think about natural beauty, within the context of a Christian story, and think of God having a creative shaping hand in creation, then perhaps there's a way in which the things that God has made are themselves works of art, carried out over time and have all this meaning within them. So if engaging the work of an artist with an eye towards what they're trying to say, what does this mean? How might this artist feel about this, and things like that. If you were shaped by that, what might it mean to engage all of creation in that way with an eye toward God as an artist? Perhaps you would find that to be a transformative thing, and perhaps there are worse ways to spend your time than trying to see the world and people in the way that God might see the world and people. So yeah, that might be a sort of difference that it could make if those things are true. But yeah, so I don't know. I hope that over time it nurtures a capacity of empathy, which seems to be your way forward for better coming to love God and the world, which is presumably something that a church should be concerned with. So that feels like that implication of beauty might have ethical implications. Sorry, that outcoming of beauty might have ethical implications. And I know you've studied ethics, so what say you about that?
I think so, a lot. So this question, for this idea, first of all, that you've set forth here about beauty as a possibility that draws us out of ourselves to connect with one another, or to learn, or even in learning to see something as beautiful, like the flowers that your wife has taught you to see as beautiful, seeing something from someone else's eyes, right? So to me, it sounds like you are talking about this as a profoundly or even fundamentally connective or empathic quality, right? To be able to experience something from someone else's viewpoint, or that draws us beyond just myself as the own center of my own universe and everything revolves around me. So first, I think if beauty has that capability, as you are saying, then yeah, there are ethical implications, because anything that has the possibility of making us more empathetic to other people, like I'm fundamentally in support of. Anything that can make us more empathic in how we interact with the world, to move beyond ourselves, I'm in support of. Now, like, at a more theoretical level, I guess, in terms of ethics, this is the background there. During my master's degree, I concentrated in ethics. My PhD is in theology with a concentration in ethics, so this is things that I think about. In thinking about beauty and ethical implications, there are two interesting ways, two ways to approach it, I think, that are interesting possibilities. One is the question of the ethics of beauty itself. This is, I think, the question of, like, is what we find beautiful an ethical question? Are the things that we see as beautiful, is that a question that has, like, moral ramifications? And I think that it does. And the second way is in this question of, is beauty a category that tells us anything about ethics? And this would be so more like, if the first is the ethics of beauty, what we find beautiful is an ethical question, and the second one then maybe is the beauty of ethics. This is the idea that perhaps justice is like the pursuit of justice, or the pursuit of a moral life is a beautiful thing, right? So there's that possibility.
That makes sense. If we're going to stick with the cosmos from chaos thing, justice would be the social equivalent to cosmos from chaos, right? That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, so I think that would be my initial answer to, yes, there are at least two ways to which there are ethical implications, but
Yeah. Do you think there might be, in terms of the realm of beauty, specifically art, might there be any connecting point within like art and the ethical, like a transformative capacity there?
Yes. So I think in terms of if you were asking about, does art as one of the avenues to communicate beauty have the possibility of ethical implications? I think, yeah, absolutely. And I think that the most obvious example is like a category such as protest art, right? Like songs or paintings that make a statement about something that is wrong with society, or that call out injustices or something like that. That would be the first place that I would go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think that becomes very interesting, because if if it invites us into the perspective of another, that would make that a pretty good avenue of communication, right? So perhaps if we carry principles like that, perhaps art is a window into the perspective of another person. If we do that as people who explore that, our first question might be like, what does this mean? What is motivating this person to say this? What does this reference anything in the past, etc.? Which I think could be a pretty efficient way to communicate without words. But then I think about protest art in other ways, and it's like this comes out of this is a different avenue than direct speech, right? So if we think about the piece by the French guy J.R. of the little kid looking over the border fence in California, like on the one hand, that could have just been like just a giant sign that's like, this thing shouldn't be here. But he didn't say that. He has a picture of a kid that raises a question, who is this kid? This is a real human, things like that. What might that mean? Which is different than saying, like, this is a thing that I think about this, period. It offers a dialogue, I think. And how we look at that, I think, is important, perhaps.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think that, so let me try an example on you of a story then. So let me start. Let me just start something and see what this evokes in you. I have a dream. Do you have some connection to this or reaction to this, right?
Yes.
Just initially, right?
MLK.
So the speech, right? Like MLK, this famous speech, that is revered throughout the country nowadays, right? As this is something beautiful. This speech, this was a beautiful speech. This is a good speech, much better than speech that we're giving right now. This is something beautiful. So this is interesting in terms of both of the ethical questions as far as beauty goes, because for this reason, I think that when King gave that speech, and even when King was assassinated, he was the most reviled man in the country, right? So at the time, that speech would not have been found beautiful by the vast majority of the country. So this is an interesting, I'm not even rendering a judgment on which of these that demonstrates in terms of ethics of beauty or beauty of ethics, just though as an example of, I think this is a way into this question of ethical implications of beauty. We now find that speech almost universally beautiful, but at the time it was not found so. Yeah. How does that strike you?
I'm going to go really brief thoughts about that because we need to be wrapping up.
Okay.
But I think on the one hand, it makes sense that I think it's a testament to the idea of beauty being an element of change, right, or an agent of change, if that is the case, because you have a bunch of people who don't see this as beautiful, because how could they? They see this person as a menace. They don't have, quote-unquote, eyes to see. They're not looking beyond the surface and asking any sort of question about it. They think here's this guy again saying these things, right? But then you fast forward, and we find ourselves in a context where we might think that is beautiful. So what changed? Well, and that's emblematic of a much broader thing. All of these things are working together to enact some sort of change, and then we get to a place where we have eyes to see this as a good thing. But didn't you tell me at some point that it took a long time, longer than seemed necessary for MLK Day to be a thing in the United States?
So this was
2000
years, right? Until the 2000s.
Yeah, so presumably there were people who thought that they understood the beauty of this, and that they understood beyond that. If we think of this as this is a poetic metaphor of a dream that then invites us into this transformative thing, they thought they knew what that meant long before that had even happened, which should maybe give us pause about whether or not we do get it, And that would be, how do you address that? You can't necessarily get outside of your context and re-enter this and say, okay, well, is there something that I'm missing? Is it possible that there was incremental change that changed enough for me to be able to see this, but maybe the rest of the stream isn't here? Well, I guess we'd have to acknowledge that might be difficult, and then see if perhaps anyone else rose up and said something similar. So absolutely not realized.
No, I'm with you, right? In terms of this is something that it is interesting to think about how this became seen as beautiful, right, over time. And I think that that does, though, connect to a separate question about the question that the issue I introduced about whether or not what we think of as a society, what we find beautiful, is an ethical question, right? And so I've been thinking most about this recently in the fact that, like, so we have a president that uses the word beautiful a lot.
Yeah, it's in the air. Yeah.
Surprisingly, like, uses this word a lot. So, right, so here's a quote. I really understand beauty, and I will tell you, she's not. I do own Miss Universe. I do own Miss USA. I mean, I own a lot of different things. I do understand beauty, and she's not. So this is like a use of the category of beauty, right? And so what I'm saying there is, in this, that I think that it is important that we think about what we as a society find beautiful, and that there are ethical implications to what we call beautiful. And that, in that quote, what that is demonstrating is a concept of beauty that is merely objectifying of persons. Right? And that is an unethical way to think of what beauty is, as she is not beautiful, she is beautiful, I know. That's like objectification, pure and simple, and so that's, I think, has profound ethical implications for what we say and find beautiful in society. That would be my ethical implication.
But what if I would say on the inside, Isaac?
Okay, well, I'm not. What do you want? Like, what are you trying to say? What point do you want to make?
I don't think that's good enough. But I think this is how we use beauty, right? It's shorthand for just what I like and what I don't like, and we don't think anything else of it. But we then end up interacting with everything around us as objects, and I don't think that's good. I think the empathetic road offers a different way forward.
I'm with you.
Cool. Do you have anything else you want to say? We should wrap up. All right. So because this was a dialogue, we covered a lot of different things, and any one of these things could have been talked about for probably a couple hours at a time. I know that because I read our full transcript. So you would be forgiven if you were very confused or like, what just happened, or what are these guys talking about? That's fine. I think that you should take those questions that you have and continue to chew on them, because maybe we're just wrong about everything, but how would you know, right? So I think, in my mind, a takeaway from this is just an offering of sorts. You've been thinking about beauty in connection to your LA 101 classes, and from a lot of different angles. Like there's an aesthetic quality to them that matters. But entertaining for a moment the idea that perhaps there is a great deal of interrogation that you could bring to anything in the world, to think about it more deeply and find the actual beauty within that, and so be transformed. I think is good. But yeah, you people are in college, and as you might have noticed, and you have a few jobs at this point in time. An important one is to encounter new ideas. And on encountering new ideas, seeking to understand them, and deciding if you agree or disagree, and then figuring out why.